When I first saw the house, it felt like a dream come true. Nestled at the edge of the woods, it stood proudly, with tall, narrow windows that seemed to watch the world like eyes. The moment we stepped inside, I could feel something off. But my husband, Mark, dismissed it. "Old houses always feel this way," he said with a grin, running his hand over the cracked wooden banister. I wanted to believe him. After all, we'd been looking for a home to start our family for months, and nothing had felt quite right until now. The house was affordable, spacious, and had that classic charm I loved. But as we explored further, each room felt colder, as if it were hiding something. Mark, oblivious to my unease, started talking excitedly about all the projects he would take on, repairing this and that. "We'll make it our own," he said. But as we entered the basement, my heart skipped a beat. The air was heavy and musty, and the dim light revealed something strange scratched into the concrete floor. The markings on the floor looked like symbols, not something you'd expect to find in an old house. They were faint, almost invisible, but they stretched from one corner of the room to the other, forming a large, intricate pattern. I knelt down, tracing my fingers over the rough lines. Mark, noticing my curiosity, chuckled. "Probably just some kids messing around," he said, dismissing it without a second thought. But something about it didn't sit right with me. The symbols felt deliberate, almost too perfect to be random graffiti. I glanced up at Mark, who had already moved on to inspecting the old boiler in the corner. I wanted to press him on it, to ask if he really didn't feel the strangeness of this place. But instead, I kept quiet, following him back upstairs. As we left the basement, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. That night, after we'd signed the paperwork and officially made the house ours, I lay in bed wide awake. Mark had fallen asleep almost instantly, the excitement of the day wearing him out. But I couldn't stop thinking about those symbols in the basement. I had tried to search for them online, but nothing came up. It was as if they didn't exist. The wind outside howled, rattling the old windows, and I pulled the blanket tighter around myself. As I lay there in the dark, I thought I heard something, a faint creaking, like footsteps on the stairs. I held my breath, straining to listen. But the house was silent, save for the groan of the wind and the distant sound of Mark snoring. I told myself it was just the house settling, a normal sound for a place so old. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. I tried to push the thoughts from my mind and closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep. But just as I was drifting off, I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of footsteps moving closer. I shot up in bed, my heart racing. The room was still, bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight filtering through the curtains. I listened, holding my breath, but the footsteps had stopped. Mark stirred beside me, mumbling something incoherent in his sleep. I debated waking him but decided against it. He'd just tell me I was imagining things. Slowly, I slipped out of bed and padded toward the door, careful not to make any noise. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside casting long shadows on the floor. I stood at the top of the stairs, peering down into the darkness below. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. I took a step forward, and as I did, the floorboard creaked beneath my foot. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind rushed past me, sending chills down my spine. I turned around, expecting to see an open window, but everything was shut tight. I hurried back to bed, my heart still pounding, telling myself it was just the wind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Over the next few days, the house seemed to settle into a strange rhythm. Mark was constantly busy, fixing up little things here and there, while I tried to make the place feel like home. But no matter how many pictures I hung or how much I rearranged the furniture, it still felt off. The basement in particular gave me an eerie feeling, but Mark had been spending a lot of time down there, working on the electrical wiring. One evening, after he'd gone to bed early, I decided to take another look at the symbols. Armed with a flashlight, I crept down the stairs and into the cold, musty air of the basement. The markings were still there, etched into the concrete like a forgotten memory. But this time they seemed different, darker, as if they'd been freshly drawn. I crouched down, examining them more closely. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small crack in the floor at the center of the pattern, barely wide enough to fit my hand. Curiosity got the better of me. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I touched the crack. To my surprise, the concrete around it crumbled easily, as if it had been weakened over time. Before I knew it, I had widened the crack enough to see inside. There was something down there, something shiny, reflecting the beam of my flashlight. I hesitated for a moment, glancing around the dark basement as if expecting someone, or something, to appear. But when nothing happened, I reached into the hole and pulled out a small metal box. It was old, rusted at the edges, and covered in a layer of dust. My heart raced as I slowly pried it open, revealing a bundle of letters, tied together with a frayed ribbon. The letters were yellowed with age, the ink faded, but I could still make out the words on the top one. To whoever finds this, beware. My hands trembled as I unfolded the letter, my eyes scanning the neat, slanted handwriting. The writer warned of strange happenings in the house, speaking of whispers in the walls, objects moving on their own, and shadows that didn't belong to anyone. They claimed that something ancient and evil was trapped beneath the house, sealed away by the symbols in the basement. "Do not disturb the markings," the letter read. "They are the only thing keeping it at bay." I swallowed hard, feeling a knot form in my stomach. What had I done? I glanced down at the crack I had opened, suddenly filled with a sense of dread. The air in the basement felt thicker now, heavier, as if the house itself was reacting to what I had uncovered. I quickly stuffed the letters back into the box and shoved it back into the hole, covering it with the loose pieces of concrete. But it was too late. The damage was done. That night, the house felt different. Mark had gone to bed early again, exhausted from his work on the basement. But I couldn't sleep. Every creak and groan of the house set my nerves on edge. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that the letter was just some prank written by the previous owner. But deep down, I knew better. As the hours ticked by, I found myself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. And then, just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway. My breath caught in my throat. This time I knew I wasn't imagining it. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped right outside our bedroom door. I lay frozen in bed, unable to move, my heart pounding in my chest. The door creaked open, just a sliver, and for a moment, I thought I saw something. A shadow, darker than the night, slipping into the room. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that whatever it was would leave. But I could feel it there, standing at the foot of the bed, watching. My mind raced, my body tense with fear. I wanted to wake Mark, but I was too scared to move. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the presence was gone. The room felt lighter, the air easier to breathe. I opened my eyes, half expecting to see the shadow still there, but the room was empty. I let out a shaky breath, my body trembling with fear. Whatever was in this house, it was getting stronger. The next morning, I told Mark about the footsteps, about the shadow, about everything. He listened, but I could tell he didn't believe me. "You've been stressed," he said, brushing a hand through his hair. "This house is old, it makes noises. You're letting your imagination get the best of you." I wanted to argue, to make him understand, but I knew it was pointless. Mark was a skeptic by nature. He wouldn't believe anything unless he saw it with his own eyes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up, listening, waiting for the footsteps to return. And when they did, I was ready. The footsteps were louder this time, more insistent. They echoed through the house, growing closer and closer until they stopped outside the bedroom door. My heart raced as I heard the door creak open again. This time, I didn't close my eyes. I watched as the shadow entered the room, moving toward the bed. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. It didn't have a face, just a mass of darkness that shifted and writhed. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I was paralyzed with fear, my mind screaming for me to move. But then, the shadow did something unexpected. It reached out, its hand brushing against Mark's arm. He stirred, blinking groggily as he woke up. For a moment, he stared at the shadow, his eyes wide with disbelief. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished. Mark sat up, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice shaking. I nodded, my heart still racing. "What the hell was that?" he asked, but I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the house was no longer safe. We had disturbed something ancient and evil, and now it was free. We packed our bags that night and left the house, never to return. But even now, years later, I can still feel its presence, lurking just at the edge of my consciousness, waiting for the